Roosevelt's brain trust realized that the president's health was so precarious that he would probably not live more than a few more months, and they were entirely correct. They also, it is said, can be argued, that they selected Harry Truman because they thought that Mr. Truman was a weak person and they could control him. And in this, they were monumentally incorrect. There's a story of a meeting that took place at the White House a few days after Harry Truman became the president, between Harry Truman, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's primary advisor. It was really between Mrs. Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins, and they invited Harry Truman because he was the president and he had to put his name on things. During Mrs. Roosevelt, incidentally, was still in residence at the White House, while the address of the President of the United States was his apartment on Connecticut Avenue. During the meeting, after discussing a particular issue, Mrs. Roosevelt said the President would want us to do it this way. Harry Truman drew himself fully up, right in his chair, and said momentous words. He said, "I am the President." The next day, Mrs. Roosevelt moved out of the White House, and Harry Truman indeed became the President of the United States. Now, on his first call to Mr. Hoover, Harry Truman was very proper and correct. He referred to the former president, addressed the former president as Mr. President. Later, as they became friends, he adopted a more informal way, and I think affectionate way. He started calling Mr. Hoover the Chief. Every time after he was president, every time he would come to New York to visit his daughter, Margaret, who died a few months ago in a nursing home in Missouri, he would call Mr. Hoover's apartment and say that he would like to come and pay his respects to the chief. It's always the way he worded it. I had the good fortune of being working for Mr. Hoover at the time, and while I was in Washington most of my time or on the road, I did have the good fortune of being at the apartment during a few of these visits by Harry Truman, and we became friends. Working for Herbert Hoover was a very interesting experience. Mr. Hoover was a very dedicated man, dedicated to business, getting things done, doing it now, doing it right. But he always had time for a few moments of personal time with his friends and associates. He was known as a man of few words, not quite as few as his predecessor, Calvin Coolidge, who was known as Silent Cal. Silent Cal was reported to have been seated next to a lady at a banquet, and she turned to him and said, "My husband bet me that I couldn't get you to say more than 2 words, and Calvin Coolidge said, "You lose." But Mr. Hoover was a man of very few words when it came to letters. The first letter that I ever saw from him came to the Postmaster General when I was assistant to the Postmaster General. The letter enclosed a letter that had been sent to Mr. Hoover about some matter dealing with the mail. The total letter said, "My dear Mr. Postmaster General, the attached seems to be your business. Faithfully, Herbert Hoover." The longest personal letter that I ever got from Herbert Hoover was 3 very short sentences. Now, part of this was because his method of answering letters was to read the letter, then turn it over, and in longhand write his answer on the back, and then pass it on to Bunny Miller, his secretary, to have her type the thing. So he didn't want long letters. He also had a strong, hard, never-bending rule that you did not send him anything in a letter or anything else that the whole text of the letter was not on the front page of one sheet of paper. Now, you could attach all the additional data that you wanted to it, but the basic letter had to be on one sheet of paper. So one time when we were going to have a birthday party for him, several months in advance, we went to the newspaper and got a double sheet of newspaper print paper. And in very small letters, we filled every square inch of that thing with a letter to Mr. Hoover. In little small letters, thousands of words, but they were all on the front of the sheet. So they met his requirements. If you see a signature of Herbert Hoover signed it. Unlike most politicians, he never allowed anybody to sign anything with his name. And he certainly did not have one of those famous signature machines that are so prevalent in Washington today. In his final years and his final illness, I received several letters from him that were signed not by hand, but by a rubber stamp of his signature, because he was not able to sign it himself, but he personally affixed those rubber stamps to his letters, because that's the man he was. One of the things that I admired most about Herbert Hoover is his affection for children, for young people. He was a prime mover in the establishment of the Boys Clubs of America. The headquarters building for the Boys Club of America in New York is the Herbert Hoover building. His wife, incidentally, was president of Girl Scouts. I wish we had time for me to tell you the story of Ray Burraker, the 12-year-old mountain boy from Madison County, who became Herbert Hoover's very close friend. Herbert Hoover, you had to throw in a sentence anyway. Herbert Hoover used to invite Ray over on Sunday to Camp Rapidan, and they would sit on the floor and, quote, read the newspaper together. That was Herbert Hoover's way of helping teach Ray how to read, because there were no schools in that part of Madison County in those days. Got this whole speech written out here somewhere. Now, I was not an admirer of Harry Truman when he was president. In fact, I walked out one time when I've had an opportunity to meet him because I didn't consider him to be good enough for me. In this, I was not alone. Today, seldom does a day pass that the press does not remind us of the low approval rating of President Bush. But the fact of the matter is that when Harry Truman left office, his approval rating was far lower than George Bush's is today. Why? Well, one reason is because he got us involved in an unpopular war halfway around the world. And yet today he's recognized as one of our great presidents. Now, I admitted to Mr. Hoover, not nose to nose, mind you, heaven forbid, but in a letter, that I had not been an admirer of his, but had learned that I was wrong and that he was a great president. And he responded, anybody who will say that has got to be all right. Our next meeting was very cordial indeed. Well, back to the story of the telephone call. After Mr. Hoover received the call from the president, he took the next train to Washington. Arrived at the Shore Motel, got into his room, didn't get his bag hardly on the floor, and the phone rang. And it was another call from the President of the United States. And Harry Truman said that he wanted to come and visit Mr. Hoover. Mr. Hoover, ever the proper one, said that he did not feel it appropriate for the President of the United States to call on a private citizen, so he would come to see him. Harry Truman, good judge of personality, said, I thought that's what you'd say, so there's a car waiting for you in front of the hotel.
Please watch Part 3 of our June 2008 breakfast meeting, also available on YouTube. The Albemarle Republican breakfast meeting is held on the second Saturday of every month at the Golden Corral Steakhouse restaurant on Route 29 North, next to the main post office. Join us for breakfast or visit us anytime at albemarlegop.org.